Hello, my friends. Welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm your host, Joanna LaFleur, and you're watching the YouTube version of the podcast. Week after week, we're coming at you with conversations with creatives and communicators all about how to communicate the best news in the world, but in the digital age. Thanks so much for watching, checking out this episode. If you want to know more, you want to check out more of our free resources, go to wordmadedigital.com or browse around this YouTube channel and you're definitely going to find some content that will help you. And of course, thank you so much to our sponsors, Compassion Canada and Wycliffe College are making this podcast possible. Enjoy the interview. Ray Aldred, it's really an honor and a privilege to have you on the podcast today. Thanks so much for your time.
Hey, you're welcome. It's good to be here.
Before we go too far, could you introduce yourself to everyone listening? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
My name is Raymond Aldred. I was born in Northern Alberta in Grand Prairie Hospital in 1960, and I have status in Canada as an Indigenous person from Swan River Band in Northern Alberta, which is north of Edmonton about, 4 hours, something like that. Anyways, I grew up in Northern Alberta, then got married there, had 4 kids, went and studied theology when I was 28 years old. I did an undergrad degree in theology in Regina, Saskatchewan, and then I did a master's, an MDiv there, and then ended up a bunch of different places. Eventually at Wycliffe College in Toronto. And now I'm the director of Indigenous Studies and the interim dean for a year at the Vancouver School of Theology. I'm married and I have 4 adult children and 5 grandkids.
Wonderful. And are your family or your grandkids, are they anywhere near you in Vancouver, or are they spread all over the country?
My daughter lives not far from me with 2 of my grandkids. And then I got a few more in Grand Prairie where my son and daughter live. Then I have my oldest son lives in Montreal.
Okay. I'm curious if we can go back to, you said at 28 you decided to go study theology.
Yep.
Why did you do that? It doesn't seem like a typical path.
Well, when I was 19 years old, I had a deeply moving religious experience. Some people call it the born again experience when I was 19 years old. So I quit drinking and I quit using drugs, and I said, God, if you help me quit, I'll do anything you want me to. And then not wanting to continue because addicts always have these grand illusions of what they're going to do. And I just didn't want to do that. So I just stayed, I made plywood for Canadian Forest Products, and I went to church and worked in a church, like served as a lay person. But then I always had this sense that I was called to ministry, full-time ministry. So when I was 28, my wife and I decided we would go. So we sold our house, moved to Regina, Saskatchewan.
So when you moved, were you moving from a reserve, or
No,
where were you living at that
I was
time?
living in Grand Prairie.
Oh, okay. You were in the city, yeah. I'm curious to know from you, as a young person, before you'd say you had really a powerful spiritual experience, you encountered Christ at 19 years old. What was your cultural experience of Christianity? Was that a positive thing? Was it negative? Was it a thing that white people did? Was it part of your community at all?
Well, mostly, because my mom didn't want us to grow up on the reserve, so we didn't. And
Okay.
because she just felt it was too hard. And my grandfather had lost his status in the Second World War when he joined the army. So they were actually kicked off the reserve. And so
Oh.
then they grew up there, or my mom grew up there, and so then that wasn't part of where I grew up. But I don't know. My mom and dad taught me how to. We lived out in the country, not very far out in the country, I suppose. But my mom and dad taught me how to fish and hunt and those kinds of things. So I was familiar with those things. My grandfather used to speak the language, but I never learned it, and my mom didn't know it. And my experience, my mom talked about how she raised her three younger sisters. So then I asked her how she managed that, and she said I prayed a lot. So she was a Catholic, devout Catholic.
Hmm.
But when she married my dad wasn't Catholic, so she left the Catholic Church because they wouldn't agree to her marriage to a non-Catholic. So they got married in a United Church.
Okay.
So then I was christened in a United Church. So when I was 11, I said to my mom, my dad doesn't go, I'm not going either. So that was the end of church. What I remember as a kid was I was about 7 or 8 years old. I was walking with my neighbor, and he said to me, God died. I said, well, that's too bad. I mean, seemed like a nice guy. I said, well, what is it? What does it mean God is dead? And he said, it means we can do whatever we want. So that's what I remember about church when I was a kid.
That's so interesting. As you say, growing up in the city, growing up in some sort of a religious experience of some kind before you could reject it for yourself. Um, and then at 19, when you had this encounter with the Lord, or however you describe it, was that in a religious setting, or was that alone in your room, or how did that happen for you?
So with my brother. So a couple years before, my brother had had this experience at an evangelistic crusade, and his life was transformed. He changed. The way that we noticed it is he didn't party anymore, but he seemed happy to me, and I was miserable. So I asked him how to be a Christian. So he talked to me about it. He said that if I asked Jesus, he would put his spirit in me, and that made sense to me. So I did. And I had this experience that God put his spirit in me and changed me. And I felt incredible forgiveness, which it felt like thinking of, it felt like a realization that you were really loved and that God knew everything that I had done and he forgave me. I had that, I don't know, it was like an assurance. And the realization that Jesus was God changed
And
everything.
not dead?
Yeah. Well, no, but you see, I grew up thinking because Jesus was the Son of God meant he was less. And somehow at
Hmm.
19, when my brother told me that, I thought about that Jesus was the Son of God. Then it occurred to me that because he was the Son, he must be just like his Father.
Hmm.
So to me, that meant that he was God because I'm just like my Father. And these relationship are all indigenous kind of understanding of, relationships. And so that's one of the things that I've always thought about, that you don't go to non-indigenous culture to learn about relationship. You go to indigenous culture to learn about relationship.
Well, tell us more. Tell us more about that.
Well, if you think about it, a lot of the people in mainstream society, or some people call it white society, they mostly worry about their rights. They're always, so it's like they're trying hard not to be connected or have no responsibility to anybody. just to have their rights to be able to do what they want to do. I found that in Indigenous understanding, there was a communal understanding that no one had a right to tell me what to do, but I was responsible for my actions and how they impacted everybody around me. And I needed to be mindful of those things, and I could understand them. I think people who grow up in more agrarian societies have a kind of a more communal understanding. Maybe the more you get into the city, the less you have that understanding. I don't know. Of course, there'll be some scholars. There'll be some scholar somewhere who argues with me and takes that point.
Well, I think in some of the communication theory about how communication tools affect a community, we talk about what happened when we got literate and got books. That our brains began to think in these lines and rows like you would see on a page, and we used to think more circular, more about the community, and then we began to separate ourselves. Literally, like the ideas on a page can be separate from ourselves; they can be on a page, other, but then also even how they are organized. It started to become how people organize themselves together. As people began to become literate, they started to put themselves in rows and lines. But of course, in Indigenous culture, one of the first things I think about as a visual is circles, gatherings of people who sit not in rows. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What is sort of behind that, or what could we learn about the community life there?
I think what it's about is understanding the connection that everybody has in land, like in the land, that the land connects us and all of our relatives are connected. So yeah, I suppose in the directions, if you think about the directions, there's 6 directions, at least 6 directions. And if you understand in all those directions that you're connected to everything. So that's kind of that communal understanding. For some Indigenous cultures like the Cree, and the Northern Plains and the Lakota, and which are very popular. Those are the popular ones, popularized in a lot of media and stuff. Circles are important, but on the West Coast, they are longhouses. They sit in a rectangle.
Right.
So.
Yeah, you're right.
And then orality. You were talking about communication theory. Walter Ong said, and I remember reading something on him, and I agreed with him that when everybody sits in a room and reads from a book, even if we're reading out loud, if we're all reading from a book, Shades of Anglican Prayer Book, it's still an individual activity because we're each holding our book and we're reading it together. But when you listen, so when you listen and one person is reciting and you're listening all together, now that's a group event. So that's where the storytelling comes in, because it's oral. So then everybody sits wherever you are. If it's in a circle, or a circle's fine, but you're listening. Everybody's listening, and everybody's connected, because there's a shared memory, and it has to do with the land, and it has to do with the struggle that we've been through. I heard one person relate it to, I remember one time we were at a conference and there was a whole bunch of speakers, and then afterwards this individual said it was like a jazz quartet, because one person would stop and this wasn't rehearsed, and the next person would just pick it up and just carry on. And it's like everybody knew the story, everybody knew what was going on, because there's that shared land and shared story that helped me thinking about how community works. And then that helped me in my theology to think about these things. And
about this passing of story?
Well, also individual and corporate identity and how that makes a difference.
Yeah, I'd love to know more about that. I mean, my understanding is narrative is really one of your specialties in theology, the
Yeah.
storytelling.
Yeah.
This is, I don't even, even that I'm struggling in what questions to ask because it's such a broad topic, but I'm so curious about story,
Right.
how to tell a good story, what makes a good story, what are we missing out of the stories in the Gospels or, in the whole Bible.
Right. Well, when I first started working in churches, I noticed that when I went to some communities, inadvertently I'd say, that story that story about Jesus when, and lots of people didn't know that story. They didn't know the gospel, but they knew different. They knew different theological doctrine, like they could tell me doctrine, but they didn't know the stories. So I thought, man, that's interesting. So then I wrote a paper called The Resurrection of Story. A very
Oh.
postmodern title because I put of in brackets, so you could read it Resurrection Story. It was always my my way of being cute, and so, but I said, Indigenous people, and I was riffing off of George Lindbeck's Nature of Doctrine, and it occurred to me that Indigenous people in Alberta, at least the ones that I had encountered, in the Prairie Province, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, a little bit in Ontario, and then a little bit in British Columbia. They'd only had two theological approaches. Missionaries either were propositionalists, so they reduced the gospel to this set of propositions that you had to believe to be a Christian.
Hmm.
But their propositions ended up replacing the story, the gospel story. So you couldn't get at it unless you came through their set of propositions, which made them in control all the time too. So Indigenous people never got to own the story, the gospel story. And then
Wow.
on the flip side, the more classic liberal mainline denominations, they came and they said to us, "Oh, you don't need that. What you had before is good enough. You you know, you have this feeling that, this religious feeling. Well, that's all religion is. So that's all you need." And again, you
Hmm.
see, everybody's own religious feeling ended up replacing the gospel. You never got the gospel again. There's other people decided that's not what you needed. And so again, another group telling us what we needed. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we actually got to own the gospel story and it became part of our culture, that we own this and we say how we understand it. It becomes one of our
Hmm.
stories. And in my dissertation, I said that it would become part of our story bundle, because everyone has a set of stories that they teach from. And wouldn't it be cool if
Hmm.
this became part of that?
Oh, I like that, the story bundle. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious about this idea of owning the story. Um, what do you think would be an indication that someone does own, quote unquote, own the story, or a community has embraced it to that level, where it does move beyond the words on a page or a doctrine? What do you think? What does that look like?
Oh, yeah, well, it's that heart language idea I got from, one part I got from Leslie Newbigin, who said, in order for something to be in the heart language, and he was getting it from the Apostle Paul's own testimony in Acts, when Jesus appears to him and speaks to him in Hebrew, which is his heart language, and says, why are you persecuting me? And then Newbigin says, for it to be in the heart language, it has to embrace the social and economic aspirations of a people. It has to take seriously how the religious categories function in the culture, and it has to take seriously the art and culture of that group. And it also has to take into account any encounter it has had with the gospel, but it has to be put into those categories to be in the heart language. And I added one more, and I got it from Henry Nouwen, and I said, it has to be on the level of human suffering. It has to be on the level of human suffering. because that's where Christ meets us. And that's heart language.
So if it's a heart language, then it's less about literal language and more about the way you connect. I mean, it might include language, like a human language, but it's beyond words or dialect and more to it cuts to the heart.
Yeah, it includes more than just reason. It There's an emotive quality. So, and Indigenous speakers and storytellers are great at, there's emotional weight to what they say. And then Jesus, when he taught with parables, he takes us in, and then suddenly we're caught, and we hear the call of the gospel. So then, when I was doing ministry, one of the ways that I thought about this, it had implication, was that if a program didn't start with on the level of emotions, if it didn't start there, then the program wasn't much good in an Indigenous context, because there was no uptake. It wasn't that the cognitive aspect or the informational component of a program was important, but if it didn't begin on the level of emotion, then people just didn't listen. And I think that's the same with good preaching. Should speak to emotion. That's why the Pentecostal preachers they're right. They're right that you need to feel something. If you don't feel something, you won't do anything.
I mean, it's so interesting. This idea of, I think the rationalization, the science movement that has removed us from. We want to sort of put our emotions aside because somehow they'll deceive us in some way, that our emotions aren't to be fully trusted.
Mm-hmm.
We have to use our brain to dissect the story, the text, the theological position.
Right.
And yet story isn't told for that. Like, Jesus isn't using a parable for it to be a literal thing. It's not a scientific rational experience. It's people being shocked by the prodigal son, or being shocked by the good Samaritan. These people who are on the outside and he's telling a story about how they're on the inside.
Right. Well,
and it's meant to, we miss some of that, I think, as a modern reader.
There you go. I like that last comment you made. That I think it's not just rational. Guys smarter than me, Stephen Toulmin, talking about the Enlightenment, he makes the point that it was reduced communication, and really modernity was the quest for this perfect language that would translate truth to across time and across cultures with no distortion. And people tried, math and different sciences. But he says in that whole, and so then, it became just reason, or just logic, just pure rational thought. And the problem with that is you lose a bunch. You actually need your emotions, and you need vision, and you need vision, and you need dreams, and you need all of those things working together. So just lest we fall quickly into either this or that. I'm not saying that. I was just talking about ordering. And in an Indigenous context, sitting with people older than me, I saw them do this thing that they would be able to understand my emotions, and through my emotions understand what I was really longing for and searching for, even when I didn't know how to put it into words. And then they would just cut through all that, and they would just ask this question, and it would bring clarity in my mind. To me, that was Indigenous wisdom, and I learned a lot.
Well, tell me more about some of this wisdom. I think there's so much that I miss, as a European background, kind of a Christian around, like, I mean, you mentioned even dreams, for example. Do you have anything to say about how dreams inform our spiritual life? Or as you say with the elders, what it's like to sit under an elder's storytelling or teaching, even just the level of respect for an elder that is so lost.
Right. Well, one of the things that it helped me to understand the gospel better because, you the way that the elders used to talk, these older guys that I would sit with, is they're talking about this subject, and the subject's in the middle, but they're talking all the way around it from a bunch of different perspectives. And that was different than what I had experienced in
Hmm.
higher education, because higher education, they really followed Rene Descartes' approach to education. Break it into the smallest pieces that you can and take the simplest piece first and fully describe that piece, and then describe all of the different way that these different pieces fit together, and then that's Western education. But
Hmm.
these elders didn't cut things apart. They would tell these stories, and these stories all had to do with this subject that we were talking about. And it seemed like they wouldn't come right out and tell you. You had to figure it out. That was the learning. You had to figure it out. Now, I did have some instructors in college and university that were like my first language teacher, who taught me Greek and Latin and Hebrew. He would not give charts. He said, no, no, no. The whole point is to make your own chart. Whereas some people just give you these charts and they tell you memorize. We learned by doing, and you made the chart, so that was closer. But Indigenous wisdom, they just tell these stories, and you're supposed to figure out what they're talking about. So then every once in a while, I remember this one fellow, one elder, he'd say to me, I'm trying to tell you something. I said, I know, and I'm not getting it. So then he'd just keep going. But he'd never come out and then finally I'd say, oh, this is what you're saying. And he'd just smile and nod his head. We'd sit there for hours. And then I'd finally,
Huh.
sometimes I went away. I don't think I ever did get it. But
Well, it's not unlike what we read in the Gospels, where Jesus would tell these stories and parables,
yep.
and people would just leave confused,
Yeah.
scratching their heads. And I think of like where he talks about, for example, in the parable of the four soil types,
Right.
how the gospel is
Yeah.
received on various types of soil. Some of it takes root and some of it doesn't.
Right.
And he basically says, if you don't even understand this, how are you going to understand anything else that I'm saying?
Right.
And they still don't understand.
The gospel writers in some places say later they understood this after Jesus had risen. So I think about that. So, I mean, my real simple, when I first started thinking about this, halfway through my MDiv, all I did was I just imagined that the characters in this it was Old Testament. I was studying prophets of some century. And all I did was just imagine that the characters in this story were Indigenous. That's all I did. I just imagined they were Indigenous. And because this story was about Abram and on the land, suddenly there was emotion in this story that I never saw before. And it came to life. It just added something to the story that wasn't there before. I could see it.
Wow.
And I could feel it. And I saw humor. Suddenly I understood why Sarah laughed when the angel said, I'm going to call you Abraham because you will be the father of many nations. And Sarah laughs. Well, why shouldn't she? The guy's so old. Like, what happens to old men? And he's going to impregnate her. Like, she laughs. It's funny.
Yeah, she knows a little bit. She of anyone in the story, she knows it what best that he's not maybe capable of it.
Told that in If you told that in a Cree context, if you told some old man, old Cree guy, I'm going to call you father of many nations, it's funny. But then you also get you get that point because suddenly one of the messengers says, "Don't laugh," and you just feel the gravity of it. Don't laugh. It's going to happen, and she gets it, and I got it. So that's one of the things
Wow.
that happened. And so I wasn't trying to cut up some things all of a sudden. I just was thinking about narrative. And so I just began to think about it. That improved my preaching and my understanding of the epistles and the scripture as a whole, because it was talking about a story. This was about a story. And that made sense. And then the job of the
Mm.
minister then was to apply this story to different situations and just be really good at telling the story. This was liberating because then it took away the need to be so creative or original. No, original. Because all I had to be was faithful. I could be creative, but all I had to be was faithful. I just had to tell these stories, but tell them in a way that I'd never told them before. And then I just thought about a hermeneutic of love. Now, I heard that from my hermeneutics professor, and I asked him years later, and he said he heard it from Tom Wright. He thinks he heard it from Tom Wright, but I don't know. So in a hermeneutic of love, and this was what I mean by owning the story. So in a hermeneutic of love, because of our relationship with the story, it will change. So then I've written papers like a reinterpretation of repentance. And what I was trying to get at was that when an Indigenous community like when it's theirs, when they say, okay, this is ours, then it would change it. But it wouldn't make it become something it was never meant to be. And in the same way, the gospel would not change Indigenous people into something they were never meant to be. And that's like a love relationship between two persons. Each person's changed because of the relationship, but they don't become something they were never meant to be. So I thought that should be the relationship between the gospel and Indigenous people, instead of all the caricatures of theology in the church that had developed because it had been used to abuse people. So, and I just found story was helpful.
Yeah, and that's where, as a recipient of my own history, sometimes, when I hear the stories of what was done by the European Christians towards Indigenous people groups, there's this piece of me that's the how did they miss the point of this? How did this happen? How did this happen? And I know that's maybe in some way naive because I know it happens again and again and again. But it's like, how did we miss the story? How did we miss the plot here?
Yeah,
To subjugate a people group under another people group.
great.
How did we miss the plot?
Mm-hmm.
It's not the way of Jesus. He's so the opposite of this,
Well,
and
it's
so
easy.
much damage
Yeah,
has
it's
been
like you said,
done.
it's easy to get caught up in it. And I think trying to work cross culturally, I used to see that all the time because I suppose you could reduce it to one group of people looking down on another, which is always a temptation. So ethnocentrism tells us is the feeling that you have when you see someone doing something radically different than you and you think it's kind of silly. Why do they do it that way? That's kind of silly. And that's ethnocentrism. And then you add to that political power and inequality, and then it turns into
Yeah,
racism. So, but
yeah,
usually it starts off people think they can improve someone else because they think, oh, those poor guys are not part of society. We need to help improve them so they can fit into
hmm.
society.
Hmm.
And I used to say most non-Indigenous Christians in Canada are paternalistic at best when it comes to First Nations people. They're paternalistic at best and racist at worst, because paternalism and racism are on the same continuum, I think. So then the relationship
towards people being inferior and needing help. Like
so it's
paternal would mean that they
yeah,
need help from a
right.
parent.
Because a friend of mine used to say this all the time, like non-Indigenous people think that they have something to offer Indigenous people. So the Western Church thinks they have something to offer Indigenous people. But they don't think the Indigenous people have anything to offer them intrinsically valuable.
Wow.
And so that's really Christendom too. Like that's the church. We're complete in the church. We don't have any need of anybody else, but we have this mission to take,
because we've got it figured out.
Yeah, because to take to you. And I found it a better place to come from. Whereas the spirituality of a lot of Indigenous people was that I'm incomplete. I have a very limited perspective and I need more people and other ways of understanding. And I need the animals to show me how to live. And I need the other people to teach me, because I'm only one person. I only have one perspective. This should produce humility in me. So it goes back to what I said about direction. So when you think about the East and the South and the West and the North and up and down, and you think about all your relatives, you realize I only have one perspective. That's not very much. I should listen more and talk less so I can understand. So that's what I saw in Indigenous people. Humility.
And do you see that in young people? Because I think what you're describing, I would think of as a trait that comes in my culture. I would say it comes with age. That young people are typically, they know the know-it-all, the less humble. I got it all figured out. Don't need the generation above me. And then as you age, you realize your smallness, your need for others, your need to serve the world in some meaningful way and participate. But is that not the same? Would you say in Indigenous communities, it's brought, young people are trained in a different way?
I was going to say, if you have near-death experiences, you realize you need people. So then, if you live
long enough to nearly die.
Well, no, but I mean, if you know how to hunt and fish and all those things, it gives you confidence that you can live. But it also helps you understand. You understand that if so, then a friend of mine said, the basis for the spirituality of our people was in the fall you pray for good hunting, and in the spring you give thanks for good hunting. And inevitably people from the city will say, well, how do you know it was good hunting? And the answer is, because you're alive.
Right. Yeah, and you didn't die.
And if it's not good hunting, you didn't, that's kind of. So then living in connection with the land does two things. One, it gives you confidence, because the land looks after us. The land has always looked after us. It'll care for us. She's our mother. She looks after us. And so, but it also produces humility, because you realize you're really you need to be dependent. You're dependent upon creation.
Right.
The Eastern Church knows this. They talk about this, that creation is the place where we live out our relationship with the Creator. But most people have forgotten what it is to be in relationship with creation. So they struggle in their relationship with the Creator. And they've forgotten that creation is sacramental. Well, Indigenous people,
Oh, say more about that.
Indigenous
Talk
people,
about the sacrament.
well, that, a sacrament is where you experience God comes close. Yes, in the sacraments.
Yeah.
Well, I'm riffing off Father Shemaman. So he said, hey, in the Eastern Church, creation is the place where we encounter the Creator. So then it's
Hmm.
sacramental. It's not just these two things, it's everything. So in this also was the understanding that at any time the Creator could speak, do something powerful through creation. And so as a result, then we hold all creation as sacred, because at any time the Creator could speak through creation.
Hmm.
Instead
Wow.
of narrowing it to just certain times of the week or certain places. There are special places, but it was that all of life was to be lived that way.
There's this interesting move now with the pandemic life that we're living globally. I've seen a lot of writing. I've experienced this myself, but also in writing, it seems to be a trend across countries. Is that people are desperate now to be in nature. People who are experiencing this pandemic are looking for hiking, space outside, to be listening to birds, to experience the heat of the sun on their face, to be near water, to go somewhere quiet and tranquil in a forest. That this like desire, there's something in us that's longing to be outside. And it's almost like it's probably been there, but we were too busy in our regular routines to even notice that we craved it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Walter Brueggemann, in his book, The Land, he notes that as Israel became more localized into cities, its incidence of idolatry increased, and
Huh.
it did better when it was in the wilderness, living in
Wow.
a tent. Yeah, there's a loss of a perception of greater freedom out in nature, and we probably all feel kind of
Hmm.
like there's a loss of freedom. I was thinking about it the other day, why people would protest against wearing masks. I think it might be part of it might be they just feel powerless. This thing makes us
Hmm.
feel powerless, and maybe if
Hmm.
we go out and protest,
Loss of control.
it makes us feel like we're doing something.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, that's probably true.
but then,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyways, I was trying to develop empathy because some of those guys just piss me off. Well, I suppose we shouldn't say that.
No, it's great. Oh man. So, if we were to spend some time in nature, which again, we seem to be craving more than ever. I know
Mm-hmm.
I seem to be hiking every weekend. I live downtown Toronto and I try to go every
Oh
week
yeah,
out of the city.
yeah.
And what should I do? I'm curious if there's something, is there a prayer or a posture or something I could say when I entered a forest, or something I could do there as a practice to connect with the creator? Is there something that would be a tradition that you have that you could offer to us?
Hey, well, a friend of mine, Randy Woodley, he used to, when you wake up, you go find water, which was the idea of you go to the river, and then it's the whole idea is, and Karl Barth picks up on this too because we're created. He said it's about being thankful. You just
Hmm.
offer thanks. Thank you,
Hmm.
Creator. Thank you for this day, for my relatives. So I usually think I face the east and I think about the wisdom and the good things that come from the east. Because on the plains, when you get an east wind, that's when you know it's going to rain. And particularly if you're living in southern Saskatchewan, rain is a good thing because you don't get a lot of it.
Hmm.
So you think about all the good things that come from the east wind. And then you face the south and you think, because I grew up in a Nordic country. Canada's a Nordic country. You think about the warm wind that comes from the south, and it always is healing. There's healing and abundance that comes from the south. And then you face the west, because that's where the sun goes down. You think about that you're getting older. And then our ancestors there, they live in the west. And one day I will go to be with my ancestors. And you think about that. And then you face the north. The north wind brings the, that's when where I grew up, when the wind switches to the north. And here on the coast too, when the wind switches from the north, it's going to get cold. And you could get a storm. And that's the mystery, the hard things that come. And then you look down to the earth and you think about our mother, the earth, and how she cares for us, provides for us. And then you look up to the Creator and you're thankful that it's a good world. This is a good world, and we're thankful. Thank you, Creator, for this day. It's good. It's good. So then that's kind of one way. But I went to school at Wycliffe. Well, and I lived in, where Wycliffe is, down in, and I lived in residence with my wife there, the married student residence, right? I could have shown up in my classes in my pajamas. Never
Flippers.
Did. Yeah, never did. But.
Yeah, I know the residence well. Yeah.
Well, one day I was running.
Building,
I used to go running, and I was there for like maybe a month, maybe 2 months. And my feet never touched the earth, just always cement and pavement. And I was out running, and I went down into that. If you stayed on that path, it takes you to the brickyard or the brick Don Valley.
Yeah.
Yeah,
the brickworks.
Yeah. Well, I was running up, I forget what street it was, and then I just ducked down onto that, and it's just a little creek. And I heard the creek and the sound in the creek, and then there was trees and there was this creek, and it drowned out the traffic noise, and I started to cry. And I thought, it's the first time in a month and a half I could hear the forest, first time. And I thought, I didn't like that. I didn't like being there, and I cried because I missed the land.
Wow. Yeah.
Some cities are better than others, so here's my plug for city development, like Montreal, Vancouver, Winnipeg, Saskatoon. In their urban planning, they make sure that there's always green space. You can always find green space, always. Toronto's the worst. You could go years and never see any. It's the worst. I don't know what they were thinking when they were planning that city.
Gotta go look for it. That's true.
It's terrible. Maybe some of the suburbs are better, but downtown Toronto's a terrible place to live. Terrible.
Well, you know what? I often go to the lake. That's where I head. I'm a walking distance from the waterfront. The lake here in Toronto looks like a sea or an ocean.
Oh yeah, I remember going down there.
And that's sort of a centering place for me. Just as I'm aware of the time and trying to wrap up our time here together. How do people find you? I mean, obviously you're teaching this Indigenous Studies Program at the Vancouver School of Theology. If people wanted to study with you or read some of your work, where could they find you?
Hey, you should. This is my plug for a course. So the first 2 weeks in January, I'm teaching an intensive, and you could do it asynchronously. You don't have to do it at the same time, because it's all Zoom, and we'll record it and everything, and I'll put it on the web. It's called Indigenous Spirituality and the Christian Faith. That's what the class is called. So Vancouver School of Theology, and you take it for credit, audit it. That's one place. And usually, sometimes I do things online for different folks. Did a Henry Nouwen podcast recently. I think you can find that by Googling it. And And if you're out in Vancouver, just come and see me, my office. I'll try to make time for you when the COVID thing is down, and then every summer for 2 weeks. Second and third week in July, we do an Indigenous summer school. Now, this year we had to do it online, and who knows what it'll be like next year, but typically that's in person. We come and we live together for 2 weeks on the campus of the University of British Columbia, and you can't find a prettier campus in Canada than the University of British Columbia.
It's like right on the ocean. It's
Yes,
stunning.
it is. Yes, it is.
Ray, thank you so much for your time.
Hey,
You've given us
welcome.
some things to chew on, to consider, and to be challenged by. New ways of thinking and how to tell better stories and own our story as people of faith in Jesus. So thank you so much.
Hey, you're welcome. You take care.